My name's Dr. Kulvarn Atwal, and I'm currently Executive Head Teacher over 2 large primary schools in the East London Borough of Redbridge. I'm joined by Sue Roffey and Chris Bagley, and I'm just going to let them introduce themselves before we begin our discussion.
Hi, I'm Sue Roffey. I'm a psychologist, academic and educator, and I run an organisation called Growing Great Schools Worldwide. My passion is about wellbeing in education.
And I'm Chris Bagley. I'm an educational psychologist, and from September onwards I'll be working with University College London Institute of Education, working with doctorate students, doing research around education reform, and I also work with an organisation called States of Mind, which is very focused on creating psychologically healthy environments for young people, and that in this context specifically means talking about education.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that's been quite interesting is in my work on teacher wellbeing, I'm one of the members of the steering group of Teacher 5 a Day, which is a Twitter organisation for teachers to support each other with their wellbeing, using the NEF 5 pillars of connect, notice, learn, stay active, and volunteer, give. And I said I'm going to be doing a webinar next week, week after, on teacher wellbeing in challenging times. And one of the things that's been quite interesting is that yes, teacher wellbeing and anxiety is probably at an all-time high, but there's a number of things in this last situation which I think has been quite positive for teacher wellbeing, in that they don't have people breathing down their neck, they don't have rigid guidelines to stick to all the time. They can be more creative, and I think that creativity is absolutely essential part of education for the future. And one of the things that teachers go into teaching for sometimes is because they're quite creative people, and quite often one of the reasons they leave is that it's knocked out of them. That and the lack of time to form relationships with young people. And it's like we now have an opportunity to take some of the positives from this situation, and there are positives, and see whether or not that they can be transferred into our education system for the future.
I think you're right there, Sue. The only last sentence I'd add is I totally agree. It's a very unique time in which there's a real opportunity to come closer to children here, isn't it?
Absolutely.
To build relationships with students when there isn't such a rigid curriculum and there isn't such pressures from above. So I totally agree with you there.
I mean, I would go quite radical here. The 1996 UN report, Delors report, talked about there being 5 pillars of learning. The first 2, learning to know and learning to do, are the meat of the curriculum, and they're important, and I'd be an idiot to say they're not. But the other 3 pillars of learning, which are learning to be, learning to live together, and learning to transform oneself and society, which is around the whole critical thinking and values for creating the world we want to live in, have been completely sidelined. And I think we need to be thinking about what is our education system for? And maybe we need to, first of all, can I just pass that over to the 2 of you? I've got lots of ideas about this. But one of the things, Chris, you just said is that we have to put the whole child and each and every child at the centre of all of this, not just have this rigid one-size-fits-all, which it doesn't, for all of our students.
Well, one thing I'd add to that, Sue, is I now have experience of working in schools which, for whatever reason, are requiring improvement. And I have a clear model which was formed, conceptual framework through my doctoral research that I draw upon. But just touching upon what you're saying in terms of what children need and what schools need, the first thing I do is take pressure off teachers.
Yes.
And we implement a rights respecting school ethos, which means that values, how we speak to each other, how we treat each other, how we enable everyone to have a voice, is central to everything.
Yes.
And almost when a school's struggling, I have to tell people to just slow down and consider what learning looks like over time, and empower those that are at the very front of the workplace, the teachers, are empowered to make decisions and to think critically and engage in research and reflect upon practice. Because what is happening is we aren't developing thinking practitioners. And an example of that is when you look at subject knowledge, we focus on subject knowledge per se, how to teach long division, rather than, well, how do you engage children to want to be mathematicians, to want to be creative, to think creatively. And we need to move from an education system which is about much less about instruction and much more about discovery. Because if I discover a formula for myself, it's going to be so much more powerful in my thinking than if I'm instructed how to use a formula. And we do need to look at the curriculum. We do need to look at it, what we want for our curriculum. Is it too packed? Is it purely based on acquisition of knowledge? Is it to prepare people to pass tests? Because for me, that's not learning, that's performing. And that is the biggest thing that we really need to focus on. A curriculum that encourages and enables children to engage in learning, to have a passion and a thirst for learning, and to be able to think creatively. As simple as something like the children here will tell you the importance of learning from mistakes. And I would say that as they get older, whether they're the teachers or the children, they are afraid of making mistakes, and that stifles learning and stifles creativity.
I think teachers should routinely make mistakes and tell children that they've made them, because one of the things that kids do is that they learn by modelling themselves on the people around them. They learn their behaviour, they learn their attitudes and all the rest of it. I think that one of the things that we have noticed from the recent lockdown is that there's been an enormous focus on what you can learn from the internet. You know, there is a mass of information out there, and the teacher role might in fact change in the future, not to deliver that information, because that knowledge can be delivered much better by David Attenborough or by the guy reading the history stories, you know, and what the teacher's role is to look at how well does that child understand? Are they able to apply that knowledge? Can they critique it? Because obviously you want to know whether or not a child is able to sort of think of the pros and cons of certain sort of positions that they take, and whether or not that actually also links in with our democracy, because critical thinking is part of a democratic state. So I think that not only might we be thinking about a different sort of curriculum, but we might be thinking about a different sorts of pedagogy, and maybe a different way of evaluating how well youngsters have learnt. I'm a huge fan of personal bests, so that kids are always seeing themselves as winners, not in competition with others.
Yeah, I think adding to that is that that will lead them to be able to identify, in the same way they do when they're playing a computer game, that effort leads to success, and that they're competing against themselves rather than anybody else. Interesting, just moving on from that, in terms of a little example of how our inspection framework stifles the kinds of creativity that you're talking about. And we had a recent inspection last year in which our NQT was better qualified in understanding our teaching pedagogy than the lead inspectors. So we had this situation at the end of the first day where the lead inspectors are saying that we've heard your year ones read, they're amazing. We've heard your year twos read, they're amazing. Your children are so articulate and so confident, they're able to question and critique. The outcomes are amazing. We just don't know how your teachers are doing it, because they were looking for performance when they were going into the classroom, but we use a dialogic teaching approach where the role of the teacher is less about delivering information and much more about facilitating talk and dialogue, so that when you go into reception class, they've already learned the rules of successful talk, because you have to learn them. You have to learn to listen. You have to learn to respond. So our 4-year-olds will be saying, I agree with, I disagree with, because, whereas our 11-year-olds is, well, actually, I think that's quite interesting. I partially agree with that, because by enabling them to learn through talk, we are giving them the tools to be able to communicate, to be able to share their emotions, their feelings. And we get some of that in terms of tests, because this is the argument people say. We are one of only 34 primary or secondary schools in the whole of London that's been awarded the Mayor of London Schools for Success Award, which is awarded to schools who demonstrate the highest progress for lowest prior attainers. Because the dialogic environment enables everybody, it has a sense of equity, everybody has a voice, and everybody is enabled to succeed. And our children are very confident at taking tests, not because they're trained to do tests, it's because they are able to articulate what they know. And say, for example, in maths, they have a self-confidence because they've been able to discuss and critique their mathematical thinking and their methodology when they approach maths. But when I talk about that with other people, that requires cultural change in schools.
Yeah.
That requires a long-term whole school approach. And when you were talking earlier about the teachers not getting the teacher training, if you are growing up, and this is not about whether it's a trust or it's a state or it's a local authority school, but if you are growing up in a compliance and monitoring culture, you will produce leaders who will then lead others in a culture of compliance. And that is very difficult for them to then move to a model of empowerment, which enables distributed voice amongst everyone. If you're creating people that are there to have a sense of power and comply, that will then translate to the children. And that will not lead to the levels of success that we see, particularly for disadvantaged children.
I'm just wondering whether it's worth, Kulvarn, going back a few paces and for people to know why it looks like this now, why education looks like this, and why Ofsted and the DfE have structured it this way. And I'm just wondering if it's helpful to go back to the 1988 Education Act, when teacher autonomy was massively rescinded and schools became predominantly around outcomes and competition. And that's obviously become more and more prevalent in schooling over the last 30 years. And we're now in a situation, particularly given academies and free schooling, where young people are treated basically as objects, often, not by your school, Kulvarn, but that's the norm, isn't it? I think we'd all agree. And schools are often, particularly ones that are run using a very competitive model where outcomes are the main thing that's prioritised, schools basically are interested in young people to the extent to which they give them a positive outcome, aren't they? So young people are not necessarily treated like whole human beings, they're treated like commodities. And I personally would argue it's very unlikely, thinking about what education is for, that there'd be a mass shift anywhere else under a state system. That's just my view. So what I'm advocating for, and what I'm thinking about now with young people and professionals and teachers, is around a concept of a learning community that doesn't necessarily involve the state, and the extent to which the exam system narrows young people's learning to a point where they're not actually able to consider themselves as human beings, explore their own strengths, interests, etc. I wonder whether that's possible in a state system. And I wanted to ask you both about that. I'm really intrigued whether you think that's possible, particularly given we have a Conservative government now. But if we did have a Labour government come in and then change the curriculum, it's going to be likely that a top-down education system is going to allow young people and local communities to develop their own sense of what success means.
I think there are two things that I would like to say. That first of all is that there's in a number of the independent schools, and certainly in international schools, they do the International Baccalaureate, which gives kids more agency. It's a much broader curriculum, and they do a lot of their own learning. In terms of its difference between the things that happens in most state schools, which is very, very narrow and very didactic. It's a different way of doing things. But there's also the option, which has been dismissed by a lot of people with the powers that be, which is project-based learning, which is around certainly having some clarified outcomes about what you want children to learn from something, but actually giving them, a whole project, problem-based learning to learn from. And the outcomes from that, especially if you work in cooperative ways, is much better for kids, and it's much more motivating for them. I mean, I don't know what other people think about that.
No, I think, well, I would certainly feel in a position of responsibility. I have a duty over the coming months to provide a voice in terms of what I think we can move towards in terms of more children's autonomy and empowerment. And just going back to the history, because I'm a bit of a lover of education history, and what may have been right in 1988 always needs to be reviewed. So where the argument is the autonomy of schools in the 80s meant there was a great variation in the quality of children's learning, when you move to an approach which is based on the marketisation of education, it is inevitable that you will measure that which is easily measurable. Try getting the school to measure the impact it has on a child's sense of well-being and esteem, self-confidence. And I'm going to tell you that traditionally I've worked with what we would see as lower retaining children. I still cannot believe that as a country we use terms like low ability, middle ability, higher ability, gifted and talented. Learning isn't a race. This is about having a sense of lifelong passion for learning. And I feel that through an approach which sort of denies children's voice and says, no, that's not important because we've got to get this done, because you've got to get through this, is actually takes away the purpose of what we should see education as. Every child I've spoken to, what they're missing about school, they ain't missing spelling tests. They're missing their friends. Yeah. They're missing a sense of community. They're missing a sense of attachment, of well-being, of belonging. And we forget this sort of, a lot of my research is drawn from situated learning. That much learning that takes place in schools happens socially and informally from children talking to each other. And if you stifle that social, informal, situated learning, diverse voices in the classroom, whether it's through streaming, ability sets, and you're basically saying these are the children that are going to get maths, and then if you get maths, you do computer science. What we're doing is we're defining children, we're defining what they can possibly do, when really we should be empowering them to lead their learning and think in far more creative ways. Because again, what do we want? We want a more fairer society, we want a more critical society, we want children to be leading change. Do we honestly think we have an education system which is enabling them to do that? And if what Chris is talking about is, if we can't do it at a state level, how can we influence it in different ways? Which I think is a dialogue we need to have.
Well, absolutely, and that's sort of what I'm trying to work on at the moment. And I'm certainly not suggesting that for every single family and for every single child, exam-based outcomes and that direct instruction system is the wrong thing. For some young people, they might perceive that that's how they like to learn. Some young people might feel that they're really self-actualizing, shall we say, from that. But I think what I'm wondering about and trying to link in with you guys and others with is around how can we make young people, families, and the school communities themselves be the ones who define what success means? And I think the way it's currently situated at the moment, where we have a government who believes in markets and not human beings, is defining what success means. And that's fundamentally leading to really significant symptoms like exclusions, which don't exist in many European countries. They're just not there. This is a uniquely British and specifically English problem, as you'll be aware. And other issues that I'm coming across in my psychology work and my writing, which is young people whose sense of identity is crushed, young people who are leaving school and they're saying very overtly that they don't really know who they are, they don't really know what their skills are. They perceive that their identity has been reduced to student, which is a label that has absolutely nothing to do with them as a whole person. So I think I would agree with both what you're saying there around project-based learning and situated learning in real-life contexts that are meaningful to the human being who's doing the learning is the way that you can get people to feel stimulated, motivated, and that they can leave an education system perceiving themselves to be a worthy person. And at the moment, we just see so much of the opposite going on, don't we?
And we are being sold a myth about what it means to be successful, because we are limiting. There's a lot around on authentic well-being and authentic happiness, and in fact, the government have taken on board some of this well-being ideas in a way. But actually, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing half the time. So well-being is sort of said that if you pass these exams, you'll get into a good university and you'll get a good job and you'll get status and you'll get money, right? And that is so not true for ever so many kids. It's either sort of beyond them, or when they get to university. I mean, some of those hot-housed young people get to university and drop out because, one, they're left to their own devices and they're not being hot-housed. You know, their motivation and their mental health take a hit, and we know that that's not uncommon to happen. And the other thing that I think is worth saying at this point is what we are doing now will impact on our society in the future and the parents that are going to be the next generation. My doctoral research was on the views of parents in their interactions with schools when behaviour was a problem. And so often their own experiences of education determined their approach to schools when that happened. And it was, and that's true across everything. The work that I've done in Australia around breaking intergenerational cycles of disadvantage, I think we need to be thinking about doing that and doing that now, because what we're doing at the moment is reinforcing intergenerational cycles of disadvantage. It's not happening everywhere. There's some wonderful work going on here and there. Glasgow and their Nurturing City frameworks is absolutely fabulous. And some of the people who've taken up some of my frameworks on Aspire, agency, safety, positivity, inclusion, respect and equity, as a framework for what they're doing, is also having an impact. But I think that overall, we really need to take this opportunity as it sort of has presented itself to us, to really start challenging what is happening and not happening in our schools.
I just want to pick up on, thanks for that, Sue, Chris's point about direct instruction, because my background is in teacher professional learning, and I think we also have to question to which extent the system we've created stifles teacher voice and teacher autonomy. So my work is based on the fact that the single most important factor that impacts on children's learning in schools, not from home or from wherever else, is actually the quality of teaching and quality of engagement. And if then as leaders we can invest in teacher professional learning through teacher research and develop teacher critical thinking and teacher autonomy, you are going to have a massive consequential impact upon children, because those teachers will be able to question and they will be able to make very skillful decisions in the moment about when to use direct instruction, okay? When to facilitate the talk, when to let the discussion continue, and even little things like we have to train our teachers to say less in class, to not feel they have to respond to everything, because if you don't respond, that child may add more, or other children may add. So this, like Robin Alexander's work on interthinking, Socratic thinking, which gives the children a sense of agency. But if we're not giving teachers agency, teachers are not going to give children agency. And I sense out there that there is a lot of frustration. And I think there needs to be better professional learning for principals and leaders and CEOs, etc., whatever you want to call it, to enable them to empower teachers to deliver better outcomes for children. And because children know when they've made a connection with an adult, and they also know when they haven't made a connection with an adult. Absolutely. And it does fundamentally impact upon their engagement and their learning. And just as a practical point, and I know that obviously in my house, my children may have more advantages than other children may have. But my son's in year 9, and I've always been quite concerned about his engagement and what he wants to focus on and what he doesn't want to focus on. Since the, I've got away because there's children waiting. Since the lockdown, he's read the first complete novel of his own choice that he asked us to buy from Amazon, because he was particularly interested in black culture in America, and that has made me happier than anything, that he is choosing a book he wants to read. And he's actually said to me that he didn't go to sleep till midnight one night, because every time he got to the end of a chapter he wanted to read on, which you can't teach someone. You have to engender that love. And the second thing, he asked for $49 to do a research project sponsored by Harvard on an aspect he was just simply interested in. And I think that really reflects the difference between directing and controlling, or empowering and enabling. And these are things that we may need to look long term in terms of state education, but in the short term, pilot groups of schools and projects to say, actually, how do we want to define educational success in our schools?
Chris, do you want to sum up? I think I've already said quite a lot, and Kulvarn has.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, fascinating discussion. It's really nice to meet you both in person, as it were, if this counts as in person. I suppose to sum up, I mean, I think from my perspective, and listening to the young people, listen to yourselves, there are some themes that are absolutely concrete here, and they're really coherent in my mind. And a couple of concepts that I think are crucial. One is freedom. I think young people need to experience both negative freedom and positive freedom in their learning. They need to learn to be free, and that means getting out of their way as much as possible, whilst also providing opportunities for them to pursue their own strengths and develop their own sense of worth. You can do both. The education system doesn't either. It's an entirely authoritarian climate. It's a straitjacket, as you put it earlier, I think, Sue. And the way to get around that, to move forward from that, I think, is to build on their self-determination. And you'll probably know about self-determination theory. Absolutely excellent evidence base for that. Young people need to perceive themselves as competent. They need to feel related to other young people, and that includes working with other young people. Collective intelligence is a thing. Individual intelligence doesn't really exist. We don't exist without each other.
Yes.
And the final one is autonomy. And none of those things exist in our system at the moment. And I think what is absolutely crucial for us all to come together around is the fact that this is not some airy-fairy, wishy-washy, progressive nonsense, which it's portrayed as. This is an evidence-based approach which works everywhere it's operational.
Yeah.
Some whole countries have moved down this road. And I think the way to pursue that, from my perspective at the moment, is to try and build alternatives that are outside the state system. Because as I mentioned earlier, I think it's such a marketized and competition-based system at the moment. I think it'd be very difficult to set up an education system within the current state. I'm not suggesting schools don't do great practice. They do, but I think it'd be interesting to try and develop and think about alternatives. Because I think if people can see alternatives and they can actually visit, view it, look at it, and try and reflect on it themselves, it's more likely to promote more systemic change. Because I think at the moment, the narrative that comes from government is very narrow, and personally, I think there needs to be other options out there. So that's how I'll finish off.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.